Welcome back. This is the France 24 debate. The Syrian conflict's been going on for 3 years. This Wednesday in Switzerland, for the first time, rival delegations at the same peace conference. That's about all they've agreed on, is to attend so far. The real nitty-gritty, our panel was telling us before the break, begins in the coming days at those Geneva 2 talks. Our panel, which consists of, from Abu Dhabi, Faisal al-YAFAI, chief columnist at the Gulf daily newspaper The National. Welcome back as well to Andrei GRATCHEV, former spokesperson for the Soviet Union's last president, Mikhail Gorbatchev. Also with us, former U.S. diplomat William Jordan, whose postings included Damascus. Attorney and analyst Ardavan Amir Aslani, and joining us from London, Julian Barnes-Darcy of the European Council on Foreign Relations. Before the break, Faisal al-YAFAI drawing the parallel, obviously, with the conflict in a neighboring Lebanon, which, for 15 years was the vacant lot where the region came to settle its differences. And now Syria has been at it for 3 years, and the fighting's still going on.
I had an issue with the bit of the narrative about how the Lebanese civil war basically ended. I agree that in the run-up to the Taif agreement, that Lakhdar Brahimi, working for the Arab League at the time, managed to bring about some kind of a political agreement. A lot of that was sidetracked or momentarily put aside because General Michel Aoun, who had taken over power as the Christian leader of the ostensible government of Lebanon, refused to abide by the Taif Accord, and it was only the Syrian military intervention in 1990 that allowed for, at last, the situation to be pacified to the point where you had a peaceful resolution or an end to the Lebanese civil war, and a resolution that was not so durable as to prevent Lebanon from continuing to have problems.
Andrei GRATCHEV, there's in the former Yugoslavia, it was when the West intervened that it changed the equation. Then there were the Dayton Accords. That came much later. Is it going to need an outside intervention?
Yeah. Well, I would say that any parallel that we would like to apply to a conflict in Syria would certainly be limited in value, because after all, every war is different. And here in these concrete situations, certainly you can make any kind of comparison. Lebanon or why not Afghanistan or even Vietnam. Mm-hmm. There was a peace conference on Vietnam that lasted for several years in Paris, with again the parties of conflict that were initially on totally opposite terms and with certainly quite different expectations when they accepted to come to Paris. So here the problem is whether we are at the beginning of the end of the war. That means, every war, after all, ends one day. Or we are perhaps, if not in the middle, maybe at the opening of something even worse than just the civil war in Syria. Because we shouldn't forget that there is a multitude of conflicts that are involved in this, relatively small country. There is a conflict also between Shia and Sunnite communities. And at this stage, we do not know whether it's not already too late, with all the goodwill and, let's say, common intentions of the two former superpowers like the United States and Russia, to try to limit the damage and, let's say, to limit the forest fire.
Ardavan, Amir Aslani, when you see the spillover effect in Iraq, in Lebanon, is it already too late?
In Israel,
is it already too late?
It's never too late to try to improve things, that's for sure. But the reality is that we have in this conference people who supposedly had a certain legitimacy 3 years ago. This Syrian coalition, for example, 1/3 of its members voted not to attend. So you have today people representing 2/3 of a coalition that doesn't have, and we all agree on this, any legitimacy on the ground in Syria, talking in the name of the Syrian people. at a time when the entire Jewish strategy of the region has changed. I mean, the Israelis were petrified a couple of days ago when they discovered that the Katyusha missiles sent from southern Lebanon into Israel were shot not by Hezbollah, but by Islamic radicals, the same guys that are fighting the Assad regime. Turkey, where the Syrian coalition is based, has begun shooting from its own territory into the al-Nusra and ISIS and al-Qaeda movements in Syria, because they're seeing that the situation is totally changing, and that Syria may become tomorrow a haven for world-class Islamo-fascists hanging around. And the reality is today that the international community has brought credibility to the Assad regime. The signing of the deal on the chemical weapons brought credibility to the Assad regime, because this means that you need to keep the Assad regime so as to implement the deal. And now Western countries are keen in cooperating with Assad. This is what was said by a previous U.S. ambassador to Iraq, to cooperate with him so as to be able to put their hands on all the European and American jihadists who are fighting over there. You should know people from Indonesia, from Uzbekistan, are fighting in Syria. This has become, as Mr. GRATCHEV pointed out,
Indonesia,
an international conflict
and also
all over the Sunni world.
And also, I should say, Julian Barnes-Darcey from France and Britain. In fact, over the weekend, we heard a statement from the French Interior Minister saying jihadists, between those who are going, are there or have come back, number 700 French citizens we're talking about only. And he was saying that's the top concern security-wise for his country in the years to come. Do you agree with Ardavan that has completely shifted the focus?
Well, I think there's a desire by some to make that the prime focus, but I'm not sure it's really dominating yet. I mean, clearly there's a security risk. As more and more people head towards the conflict, there is a risk that they're going to come back to Europe. But I think most people still acknowledge that the root cause of the security threat that emerges from jihadists coming and going back is the continuation of the conflict itself. So a narrow counterterrorism response is clearly not going to limit that threat. The only way to stop this becoming a more profound long-term threat is to find some kind of resolution. And I think clearly the risks of a regional-wide conflict from Lebanon through Syria into Iraq, which is very sectarian, which is drawing in Sunni jihadists, many of whom are funded and supported by groups in the Gulf, is extremely dangerous. And it's not just a conflict in Syria itself. It's a conflict between the Iranians and the Saudis. It's sectarian on the surface, but very much geopolitical in terms of a desire for control of the region. And that's the issue that needs to be addressed if the counterterrorism issue is going to be addressed.
Sayan on Twitter saying, I bet my first 10 years of wages that Geneva 2 will end up like the first one. We'll see about that. So a lot of skepticism among the viewers. Interesting, picking up on what was just said, how Russia's position is perhaps different from that of Iran's. Let's listen to the words used by the Russian foreign minister on Tuesday when he said he was sorry to see the Iranians uninvited.
Of course it is a mistake, and I've said so on many occasions, but it will not be a catastrophe. Iran is being told to consent to preconditions imposed by the opposition with the support of the whole range of its supporters. This is not very graceful. As I see it, if you take the settlement principle stated in the Geneva 1 communiqué as the criteria, then dozens of countries shouldn't be invited either because they support regime change.
Am I wrong in saying, Andrei GRATCHEV, listening to Sergei Lavrov, that Russia's interests and Iran's interests are quite different, in fact? And what, if so, how?
Well, it's natural that Russia's interests shouldn't coincide with the Iranian interests. At the same time, I think that the very fact that after all, and after at least 1 year lost in between the Geneva 1 and Geneva 2, it's a positive thing that, Geneva 2, even if it will have to be followed by Geneva 3 and else, is happening now. First, there is still a hope that there would appear the perspective of ceasefire, maybe local ceasefires at the beginning, maybe a more general ceasefire at the time, but not earlier, then both sides would lose hope of gaining on the ground. Otherwise, they will just be tempted to use the conference as a possibility to gain time in order to advance on the ground.
And tell me, how much pull does Moscow have with Tehran?
Well, it has a lot of common interests. Certainly.
But how much influence?
Well, it's economic. It's certainly a strategic situation. Well, after all, Iran is a neighboring country to Russia, and that's why Russians should be much more sensible to maybe some other countries which are more distant from Iran than others. Well, I would say that the very fact that Russia is one of the co-organizers of the conference makes it co-responsible for its result, be it failure or be it success. And already from this point of view, I think this is already an element to influence also the position of Iran, because even Iran cannot pretend or cannot claim or cannot hope to be a sole player on the scene. But at the same time, let's not forget, Iran this year is not the Iran of 1 year before. And this is certainly an element that Russia and probably the others should take into the equation.
You say that, but let me ask you, Ardavan Amir Aslani. We had the former French ambassador to Iran on yesterday, and he was saying when it comes to the issue of the nuclear negotiations, the new president, Hassan Rouhani, yes, he's got a lot of pull on it. It's his topic. However, when it comes to Syria, he's not the guy in charge.
I don't think that is true. I think that Iran, when Iran looks at the nuclear issue, Iran also looks at the situation in the entire Middle East, and Iran fears the dangers that are coming towards it. It was mentioned by Mr. GRATCHEV, but we should remember that this conflict is only an insignificant part of what it may become in the future. Iranians are Shia. It is the dominant Shia power in the Middle East. But they also see what's happening in Iraq. I mean, for 2 consecutive weeks, the city of Fallujah, of U.S. fame, was occupied by the same jihadists are fighting the Assad regime. And Iran feels that there is an existential security threat to its own security if the jihadists were supposed to prevail in Syria, because then the next domino that will fall would be Iraq. We should not also forget about Afghanistan. The Americans have not been able so far to sign a security deal with the Karzai regime, which means that by the end of this year, we may no longer have any American soldiers in Afghanistan. And there's talk of the Islamist Sunni Taliban, the same mentality, the same folks that share the same common values as the Islamists that are fighting in Syria, coming back to Kabul. So Iran feels that it is surrounded more and more so by jihadist groups funded by certain countries in the Persian Gulf, such as Saudi Arabia, openly, who are present at this conference, and Iran feels that it needs to end its isolation. That's why it has a close relationship with Russia. They have the same issues. The Olympics, one of the great fears about the Olympics is Islamic terrorism in the Caucasus. And the Russians feel that Iran may at one point or another be on the Russian side in trying to contain the Islamofascism that is rising all across the Middle East.
Faisal al-YAFAI, your thoughts?
I'm sorry, I've been shaking my head when Ardavan was speaking. I don't really buy the argument that the Iranians are concerned about jihadism. The Iranians, I rather take Julian Barnes's point that the Iranians have a geopolitical strategy, and that strategy has on the top of it a sectarian basis, but it is not sectarian in nature. What the Iranians really are concerned about in Iraq is maintaining their power. One of the reasons why the jihadis have been able to have so much pull on the ground in Fallujah and in other places in Iraq has been because of what Nouri al-Maliki, the Iraqi prime minister, has done, and he has done it with the blessing of the Iranians. This is not a question of a very large country like Iran seeing these threats surrounding it from jihadis. It's more a question of a very large country like Iran interfering systematically in countries all across the Arab world. They support the Houthis in the north of Yemen. They support Hezbollah in Lebanon. We see what they're doing in Syria. We see what they're doing in Iraq. Everywhere you look around the Middle East, you see the hand of Iran. And the hand of Iran has been historically very destructive. Now, the Gulf states and other countries have said the Iranians need to come back into the fold. It is to everybody's benefit that the Iranians have a stake in the region. But that stake, that role in the region has to be a meaningful one. It has to be one where they play by the rules of the international community and they don't create this chaos and this destruction that we're seeing in Syria and we're seeing in Iraq.
Andrei GRATCHEV.
Yeah, trying to be brief, when I was saying that Iran this year is not the Iran of 1 year before, is that I think it's also the moment to remind, maybe it's not a proper time, on the day of the opening of the conference on Syria, the other level of international security concern. And this brings us back to understanding the Russian position and probably the American position. Because Iran that accepts the nuclear deal, or at least the beginning of the process of limiting of its nuclear program, and in this way, perhaps bringing back the hope of strengthening the regime of ending the spreading of the nuclear weapon, just as Mr. Assad, as President Assad, at least for the time being. Now, this year represents the country and the authority that has accepted and has started to implement the decision on the elimination and destruction of the chemical weapons. I think these are the elements that the countries like at least Russia and the United States, but I think also many others, cannot ignore.
William Jordan.
I see the diplomatic reality here as being one that I've stated several times on this platform, and that is the international community has very little leverage or control over the situation in Syria, and it's doing desperately whatever it can. The Geneva framework for these negotiations is the best it has been able to come up with.
When Lakhdar Brahimi talks about the possibility of, for instance, humanitarian corridors, is that doable?
I have no idea. I think, again, it's in terms of trying to come up with some immediate deliverables to address something other than the core and so far irresolvable political issues. You sort of try to get whatever you can because, as I believe Andrei GRATCHEV said earlier, if you can begin to make some sort of progress between the two parties where they agree on something and it can stick and be accepted by the people on the ground in Syria who are the ones who are really fighting, then you've begun to get people invested in a process that you may then build on to get at the core problem. Personally, I don't believe a lot of this is going to be possible. I think that, as has been noted before, and as I have said on this platform many, many times, the conflict in Syria is fundamentally a conflict about Syria, its failure as a nation state, as an independent nation state, into the time of the Ba'ath, the problems of everything having to do with the Sunni Muslim opposition to an Alawite-dominated regime in the country, everything that went back to the Muslim Brotherhood uprising in the late 1970s and early 1980s, which was finally suppressed in Hama by the regime.
With thousands killed in 1980.
With thousands killed, but remember, this was something that most Syrians did not want the Muslim Brotherhood to prevail, because in many ways, the platform that they advocated at the time was the same as, was comparable to what you see now in terms of the jihadis. And what I regret seeing happen is this insane focus, frankly, on the jihadist threat in Syria and Iraq, to the detriment of an understanding of the fundamental intra-Syrian nature of this conflict.
But the foreigners are there. That's a reality.
No, and we knew they were going to be there from the moment this became a civil war, through which porous borders, people from outside would be able to come in. The point is to focus on immediate humanitarian relief for the people, to try to allow this political process that has been launched at Geneva to gain some reality, and then, unfortunately, trying to or allowing the conflict in Syria on the ground to play out, for the parties to bleed themselves out, to reach the point where everyone finally decides the only way we can resolve this is through a genuine political process brokered by the international community.
All right. David on Twitter saying Geneva 2 is a lost cause. You can't negotiate peace when they don't want to stop killing each other. The U.S. Secretary of State, he's went to great pains to say it's not a lost cause this Wednesday. And he went to great pains, first of all, getting at least some of the Syrian rebels to show up in Switzerland. He insists the aim is still to oust Assad.
Bashar Assad will not be part of that transition government. There is no way possible in the imagination that the man who has led the brutal response to his own people could regain the legitimacy to govern.
Of course, that's not how the man himself sees it, the Syrian president speaking to the French news agency AFP on Monday.
There are still 4 months before the election date is announced. If in that time there is public desire and a public opinion in favour of my candidacy, I will not hesitate for a second to run for election. In short, we can say that the chances for my candidacy are significant.
And Linda on Twitter saying Syrians should determine who's to be the leader of their country. Faisal al-YAFAI, your reaction to what Assad said there?
I mean, what do you say to a man like that? This is a man who has never faced a genuine election, but considered 96.4% or whatever it is to be the true representation of the Syrian people's will. You have to ask yourself, when he says he will definitely stand if the Syrian people want him to, you have to ask, how might the Syrian people tell him they don't want him to stand? I mean, if you don't imagine that the last 3 years are a very clear indication that a significant minority, probably even a majority, want him to go, I really don't know what we can do for him. I'd like to say something, though, about what can be done. And I think that some of your other panelists made very good points about what can be achieved in Geneva. The problem with Geneva is that it really is a sequence of small steps forward when what you need is a giant leap. But unfortunately, you're not going to get the giant leap. So I think if you're looking at small possibilities, small ceasefires, aid corridors, medical assistance, then that is probably the best that is going to come out of it. What I do agree with when we speak about what John Kerry said is that it is an important basis to start from the idea that there can be no legitimacy, no way forward for Assad to maintain his position in Syria. You cannot have a situation where we go into the 4th year of massacres, and we've all seen the report that has come out, very, very harrowing pictures, 11,000 dead, 55,000 images, horrendous images of what has been taking place on the ground, the tip of the iceberg. You cannot imagine that after all of this, Assad can stay in place.
All right, but as Andrei GRATCHEV was saying earlier, Assad making himself in the past year indispensable, at least on several issues. Julian Barnes Darcey, at this point, is that all we can hope for? Some small humanitarian corridors, some local ceasefires?
Well, there's that, and I think there's the fact that one has to take the progress of the different parties coming together for the first time. And this is after 3 years of conflict without any room for negotiations, the two of them sitting in the same room, and then more importantly over the coming days, having to battle through some of the issues, I think is a critical first step going forward. In terms of the Assad issue, I just want to say one thing. I mean, I think clearly Assad is detached from reality and his own understanding of his own legitimacy. But I would say that equally the position of John Kerry and a lot of the West and the opposition is also detached from reality. And that reality is that Assad maintains the strong support of a large section of the population. Whether it's a minority or a majority, we don't know, but I think he would probably win a fair election today. He still has a strong international backing from the likes of the Iranians and the Russians. He cannot simply be wished away. He will have to be part of the process unless he is going to be militarily pushed out of the country. And there is no prospect of the West doing that anytime soon. And the Gulf isn't going to manage it single-handedly. So Assad is not going away. You can't just say he can't be part of the process if you want to talk about a political solution.
All right, and we have a comment on Facebook from Believe $1 Million. Says, talks are an empty gesture. It's clear the U.S. doesn't want the war to end. And I guess we're almost out of time, but just I guess that there is this sense that everybody's still waiting for the day when the U.S. is going to send troops in, and as long as they don't, well, then that means they just want the war to continue.
And they won't send the troops in. I agree, though, with the idea that the U.S. has made a fundamental mistake from virtually the very beginning by making Assad himself the issue, and not the crimes of the regime and the need to effect some kind of a transitional change in Syria that would have to involve, as a starting point, working somehow with the regime in power. Unfortunately, the United States has pushed things to the point of demonizing Assad, as it used to do with Saddam Hussein in Iraq. And hence, behind that, I think you will constantly have this question that John Kerry continued to fan today of what might the United States someday eventually do, which is somewhat delusional, but it's always going to be out there as long as the United States makes its declarations so dire and stark.
And we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you, William Jordan. I want to thank Ardavan Amir-Aslani, as well Andrei GRATCHEV, Julian Barnes Darcey for joining us from London, as well as Faisal al-YAFAI in Dubai. Thank you for being with us here for the France 24 debate.